All right, so we close this mini chapter, whatever term we want to use for it, on campaign finance. And we look at it from a historical perspective. The reforms that have come into place and how they've gradually, and especially in the last 15 years or so, been undone. So we start with a very simple premise, actually. And that simple premise is that almost all major campaign finance reforms in the history of the United States have been born out of scandals of some description. So the first major campaign reform was something called the Pendleton Act, which came about in 1883. It came out in 1883 because of a terrifying event that happened in 1881, which was the assassination of President James Garfield, the second presidential assassination in only a 16-year span, only 16 years removed, of course, from Abraham Lincoln. But the circumstances were quite different. Lincoln's assassination was really the genesis of that, of course, was the Civil War itself and angst among those sympathetic to the Confederacy. This was quite different. James Garfield was done in by somebody who actually had campaigned on his behalf and had volunteered on his behalf, a gentleman by the name of Robert Guiteau. Guiteau was deranged. He was legit nuts. And he got this notion that he was this masterful political leader. And so he began volunteering for and campaigning for the Garfield ticket, the Republican ticket in 1880, on the premise that had been really honestly set by about a half century of political behavior in Washington, which was something called the spoil system. Begun almost, over 50 years earlier under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the spoil system was the notion to the victors go the spoils. Spoil system, or patronage, as it was more formally known, was a system by which the political party that wins the presidential elections and control of Congress can then fill appointed positions in the United States government with their benefactors. There's a famous story, may not even be true, it could be apocryphal, but there's a famous story, for example, of a governor in the Midwest appointing the son of one of his chief contributors to be the head of the state library system, which was fairly interesting because the gentleman in question could not read. Don't know if that one's true or not, but Guiteau volunteers to help the Republican ticket, thinking this will be how he gets into politics. He will be lavished for all of his efforts on behalf of the Garfield ticket. He'll be lavished with a seat at the table in the White House. Now, that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen for a couple reasons. Reason number one, Guiteau was a fairly minor player. Reason number two was that James Garfield was a reformist Republican. He was not a real believer in the spoils system. Guiteau becomes outraged that he did not get any of the offices that he sought. And so he, in his own deranged little brain, determines that the problem is that Garfield is a reformer. And a reformer is not going to give him the job that he rightfully deserves. Meanwhile, Garfield, in an attempt to appeal to kind of the old school Republicans, had nominated a New York official named Chester Arthur to be his vice president. So Garfield appoints this old school spoil system Republican who had been the commissioner of ports in New York, if I remember correctly, to be his vice president. So Guiteau, again, in his deranged little mind, is like, well, if I assassinate Garfield, certainly Chester Arthur, who understands the value of the spoil system, by golly, he'll give me a job. My friend. That's not going to be quite how it works. And of course, Guiteau instead gets, executed for his crime, not rewarded with a job in the White House. I'm sure that came as some surprise to him. But what comes out of that assassination is a reform of the civil service, the Pendleton Act, where the ability of the government to put people into governmental offices is greatly curtailed. There's a civil service exam that now has to be taken. Only people qualified for positions can be brought into them. Now, the nomination for what's qualified still is somewhat skewed, if you will. But at the end of the day, it was an attempt to put some guardrails on this system. Speaking of guardrails, we get more of them down the line in 1925, something called the Corrupt Practices Act. Corrupt Practices Act comes after the scandals of President Warren G. Harding. Now, everybody who took U.S. history and paid attention in class has heard of Teapot Dome. But that was really maybe the third most important scandal in the Harding White House. Teapot Dome was, of course, the quite corrupt Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, a poker-playing senator friend of Warren Harding's from when Warren Harding was in the Senate, basically taking up all these government oil reserves and selling them to oil companies, private oil companies, in exchange for hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes. But like I said, that might have been number 3 on the list. You also had Harding's Attorney General putting the brakes on an investigation of a foreign acquisition of an American company when it appeared that perhaps that company had bribed several members of Congress and that some of that bribe money had made its way to the Attorney General. But the biggest one was actually a very new agency called the Veterans Bureau, run by a gentleman named Forbes. Forbes had been this very charismatic veteran of World War I, had gone on the speaking trail on behalf of Harding. They'd become close friends. They vacationed together. And when Harding gets elected, he did a lot of rewarding his friends with jobs. Now, they were marginally qualified for those jobs, so the whole civil service thing we just talked about didn't apply. He put Albert Fall, who was a senator from New Mexico, in charge of federal lands. Well, he was a senator from a state that had a lot of federally owned land. That made sense. And he puts Forbes in charge of the Veterans Bureau, which was a brand new agency, staffed with a lavish budget, because the premise of this agency was to take care of those folks who had served us in the 2 great wars of that generation. The Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th century, and of course World War I. Well, Forbes was as corrupt as they came. He participated in something called requisition fraud, which is if you do it right, a way of making a ton of money very illegally. What he would do is he would say, hey, we're building a new veterans hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. Ship me 300 hospital beds. Which you were opening up a medical clinic. 300 hospital beds doesn't seem unusual, but the thing is, he'd only need 100 of them. He'd put 100 in the clinic. He'd take the other 200 and he'd sell them to private hospitals, private clinics, and pocket the money. So basically, he got the government to buy a ton of stuff, only put a fraction of that stuff in government facilities, sold the rest personally at an immense profit, and made the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars, it's estimated. He also did some garden variety fraud and corruption. One of the most famous stories about Forbes is he would go into a city where they were building some sort of a veterans facility, a hospital, a training center, whatever. And he would walk into town, basically, come off the train and inform every contractor, because, of course, contractors are the ones that build these things, in the city, I am in town, here is where I'm staying, the hotel, here are the restaurants, the 5-star super expensive restaurants I like to go to in your town, here are the type of prostitutes I prefer, here are the currencies, small bills please, that you're going to leave by the door when you leave my hotel room. I mean, he basically declared himself open for business. So this guy was immensely corrupt, and of course a new wave of reform laws come out of that. But the biggest example in modern history happens in 1974, the Watergate scandal that, of course, leads to the only resignation in scandal of a president in American history. And that is the resignation of Richard Nixon. And it led to, for those who don't know, Watergate was about breaking into the Watergate Hotel in the Democratic Party's headquarters, but it was much bigger than that. And I think a lot of people stick to that very narrow part of Watergate. Among the biggest scandals of Watergate that unraveled is how many businesses had under the table lavished Nixon's campaign and Nixon's political team for 1972 with untold amount of money, knowing full well that they'd be taken care of should Nixon win another term. One famous example was one set of training centers, called ITT, donated $1 million to the re-election campaign and did it all under the radar. So no one knew they had done it. Now, $1 million in 1972 is one hell of a lot of money. So, at the end of the day, when the whole scandal unravels and Nixon eventually is forced to resign, within 2 years you get something called FECA, the Federal Election Campaign Act. It does a few things. One, it requires the disclosure of donors. So there's no more secret donations to campaigns. Under penalty of law, both to the candidate and to the donor. Okay? You go to jail, basically. It also created the Federal Election Commission to act as an impartial third party to look at election disputes. One of those independent regulatory boards and commissions we talked about in the bureaucracy chapter. And last but not least, it puts strict limits on donations. The original limit, I believe, was $2,700. I think it was $2,500. At the end of the day, what that does is it says to individuals, you can no longer buy your way into politics. And if you do, you're going to do it at very small numbers. So all of this was to respond to the real scandal of Watergate, which was ultimately a campaign finance scandal and corruption of that level. Now, there is one exception to this rule that major campaign reform always follows major scandal, and that comes in the year 2002. It was called the McCain-Feingold Act. It was actually, its official name was the BCRA, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. So named because McCain was a Republican, John McCain, of course, who's since passed away, and Russ Feingold, a senator from the state of Wisconsin, was a Democrat. This didn't come out of huge, immense, politics-altering scandals like the assassination of Garfield or Watergate. It came out of, if I'm being completely accurate, it did come out of scandal of a sort, but not one giant scandal like Watergate, not one giant scandal like Teapot Dome, but rather a seemingly never-ending series of small scandals, many of which you saw in the film on campaign finance that we watched in class, or, we will watch, depending on when you guys view this video. What had happened is, going back to the 1970s, and I'll get to this in greater detail later, it was presumed by the court in the 70s, in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo, Buckley versus Vallejo, that campaign spending is a form of free speech. And so wealthy individuals, corporations had taken to using that premise in some pretty clever ways. The most clever way was something that became known as issue advocacy or soft money spending, which, if you watched the film, you might remember. It became incredibly common between 1990 and 2002. So you've got a corporation that does not like, let's say an oil company that doesn't like some tree-hugging, Prius-driving senator. So they would run millions of dollars of ads against that senator, saying all this horrible stuff against him. Well, of course, the limits on campaign finance set in the reforms from Watergate in the 1970s would limit how much money they could give to that tree-hugging senator's opponent. But the way around that is they'd say, no, we're just exercising our free speech. We're saying we think this senator is an awful senator and a terrible human being. We're not saying people should vote against him, because there was this exemption to the campaign laws until 2002 called the magic words exemption. And what it basically meant was, as long as your advertising didn't say vote for candidate X or vote against candidate Y, it was not considered a campaign ad. It was considered an ad about issues. And it fell under the guise of free speech. So, the McCain-Feingold law tried to close that loophole, which was called the soft money loophole, by declaring several things. One, declaring time limits on when people could run such issue advertising. An example being that you could not do it within 90 days of an election, which would really reduce the value of those soft money ads, because at the end of the day, if you run a bunch of ads about how Senator Tree Hugger's terrible in August, who notices, right? Who pays attention? So that was one restriction. There were strict restrictions on how much potential players, candidates, parties, unions, corporations could raise and spend for political affairs. One interesting loophole, or that was closed, was they actually put a limit on the gross amount of money donated. So not only were you limited in how much you could donate to a particular candidate, $2,700 or whatever it was, but it also limited the total amount of money you could spend on political campaigns. I believe the final limit on that was $117,000, to prevent highly wealthy individuals from just lavishing a political party or a group of political candidates with millions upon millions of dollars in these $2,700 increments, because they would add up over time, right? McCain-Feingold was the most far-reaching, the most broad campaign finance reform law known to that point. And it almost immediately faced legal challenges that would really ultimately undo much of the campaign finance law in this country. Opponents of reform had argued that unregulated campaign finance was actually a free speech issue. So they made the argument before the Supreme Court that spending on campaign advertising was equal to free speech. That if you limit my ability to run advertising saying that this is a great president, or this is a great senator, this is a terrible president, this is a terrible senator, you're denying me my First Amendment right to free speech. Now, the idea that spending money on political advertising is free speech may seem odd to some of you, but it's important to note that this had been a time-honored and classic precedent in our court system. Now, to quickly reset what we mean by precedent, remember that a lot of judicial decision-making, going back to our chapter on the judicial system and the judiciary branch, a lot of our court decision-making rests on precedent. The burden, when you go before the Supreme Court, is not to stick to the precedents that have already been set. The burden is to convince the court why a precedent needs to be reversed. And the precedent in the United States federal court system is a precedent that states that this idea, this concept, which maybe kind of eludes some of you, that spending is speech, is valid. It's a precedent that dates back to the 1970s. And that precedent was established in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo. In 1976, there was a candidate named of Buckley that was running, I believe it was for either governor of New York or mayor of New York City. It was one of the two. And Buckley was a very wealthy man. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on his own campaign, and that actually ran afoul of the new Federal Campaign Reform Act, the FCRA, the Watergate reforms, which limited the amount of money that could be donated to a campaign, even if it was a candidate donating money to his own campaign, which is what Buckley had done. Buckley had self-financed his campaign to the tune of several $1 million, was running ads, and either the city of New York, state of New York, again, I can't remember which of the two offices it was, stepped in and said, Buckley, you can't do that. You're violating the Federal Campaign Reform Act because you are donating excessively to your own campaign. So the Supreme Court in Buckley versus Vallejo does not strike down all the Watergate reforms, but what they do say, and that's, by the way, why the Watergate reforms continued after the Buckley case, because it only struck down one fairly narrow part of the Watergate laws, which was limiting a campaign from speaking on its own behalf, or a candidate that's self-funding their own campaign. So you guys are probably old enough to remember, because I want to say it happened in 2021, 2022. It was early 22, when a gentleman by the name of Rick Caruso ran for mayor of Los Angeles. Rick Caruso is a wealthy shopping mall developer, uber wealthy individual, and he spent something like $75 million of his own money to run for mayor of Los Angeles. And I know younger people don't watch TV as often as us olds do, but you could not avoid his TV ads, like ever. He spent so much money on advertising. And that's what the Watergate reforms were trying to basically trying to prevent, was this notion that if you don't put that reform in place, uber wealthy candidates can just drown out their opponents by using their money to buy up all the available airtime and basically freezing out their opponents. That was the logic behind it. But the Supreme Court in this case, even though they're only striking down one small part of the Watergate reform, they set a vital precedent, which is that they acknowledge that a campaign spending money on itself, or a candidate spending money on his or her own campaign, is exercising their First Amendment right to free expression, and any attempt to limit that is a violation of the First Amendment. So in 1976 in Buckley Vallejo, even though the Supreme Court does protect most of the Watergate reforms, in striking down this one reform, they set the precedent that campaign functions, particularly advertising, radio, television, today digital with the internet, is a form of free speech. And that's going to be taken to the next level in 2010, in the case that delivers the kill shot to any serious campaign reform, a case called Citizens United versus the FEC. Citizens United was a anti-liberal political action committee, and they were running an anti-Hillary Clinton film on election eve. This was in the year 2006, I believe it was, when she was running for re-election. I believe it was, or maybe it was 2000, actually, going back to 2000 when she ran for the Senate the first time. Anyways, there was a prohibition in the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, McCain-Feingold, saying corporations and unions, and Citizens United was a corporation, could not run campaign ads within 60 days of an election. And they were going to show this film. They bought time on several local networks to run this film on the eve of the election. And they were denied the ability to do so because the McCain-Feingold prevented you from doing that within 60 days. I think I said 90 days earlier. I misspoke. My apologies. It was 60 days. Still a major prohibition. Basically, in any election day, that means you're not running any campaign ads. If you're a union, a corporation, a private entity, you're not running any advertising in favor of or opposing political candidates after Labor Day. Well, in a 5-4 decision, it was extremely narrow. The court sided with the political group, arguing that this prohibition on not letting them run ads close to Election Day, and that's what this film was. It was basically an hour and 30-minute long ad. It was an infomercial, I guess we would call it. They argued that violated Citizens United's free speech rights. By the way, the time restraint thing was not just limited to corporations and unions. It was also attached to politicians. Not their own money, though. That's why it beat the Buckley loophole. It was about the franking privilege, which we talked about when we talked about the advantages that congressmen had. That was 90 days. So you could not issue franked mail home to your constituents within 90 days of an election, because franked mail had become a substitute for campaign literature. You know, you get this mailer at home about what a great congressperson your congressperson is, and lo and behold, you get the week before the election. What a coincidence. That kind of thing, right? Well, they were trying to prevent that, so they limited the ability to use the franking privilege in campaign season. They tried to do the same thing for private institutions and unions, and the Supreme Court in 2010 knocked it down. They went one step further in 1914. Wow, way to go, Singiser. In 2014, by eliminating that total limit, that gross limit on campaign contributions. It was a case called McCutcheon versus FEC. McCutcheon was a wealthy Southerner. He had donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to conservative politicians. He ran afoul of the McCain-Feingold Act because at the time of the lawsuit, the limit was $117,000. So he was told, you cannot donate any more money to Republicans, Mr. McCutcheon. You are limited to $117,000. He sued, arguing that you're denying me my free expression by allowing me to support these members of Congress. And the Supreme Court agrees and sides with McCutcheon. So the net result now is you get sort of almost like a Wild West style system of campaign finance, where all it takes is for an individual, and I can think of a few examples of this, to put untold amounts of money into the name of a shell organization, and as long as they don't formally coordinate with candidates, they can spend unlimited amounts on that candidate. There was an example. He's no longer in Congress because he was he was sort of a putz, if I have to be honest about it. There was a congressman in Indiana a few years back whose family, his dad and his brother, I think it was, created a political action committee on his behalf and seeded it with something like $10 million, which is just an incredibly high amount of money for campaigns anywhere, least of all in southern Indiana. And they got this guy who was sort of a buffoon, who I think was all 30 years old, a seat in Congress. He only lasted a couple terms, and then I don't remember exactly what the circumstances of his downfall were, but he fell out of Congress fairly quickly. But we see that at the presidential level. You've got, as I'm reading this on a Saturday morning in July of 2024, you've got Elon Musk declaring this week that he's going to give $45 million a month to the Trump campaign. And as long as he or his emissaries do not directly speak to the Trump campaign, that's street legal. That's the kind of Wild West campaign finance mentality that's been set by the Citizens United case and subsequently by the McCutcheon case. So let's close by looking at where you get campaign funding from. Individuals is one of the leading ways, of course, but that is subject to FEC limits per candidate. So I think now it's over $6,000 now that you can donate in a campaign cycle. It's $3,000 for the primary, $3,000 for the general. It might be $3,200, something like that. But you're limited. So if I was a huge fan of Adam Schiff running for the U.S. Senate, or a huge fan of Steve Garvey, I am a Dodgers fan, I can donate money to their campaigns, but I have to stop at a certain level because I'm a single individual. Political parties also, as we'll talk about shortly when we get to political parties, part of the function of political parties is they also distribute money to candidates in need. They also are subject to limits, but those limits are considerably higher. Whereas the individual level is, four figures, $6,000. It's in the single digits of thousands of dollars. I want to say the political parties are in the upper five figures, 50,000, 60,000. I don't remember the exact number, but you get the point. Higher limits. Political action committees are subject to even higher limits. And then, of course, you've got the resources that are unlimited, which are bullets 4 and 5. Personal resources, which is why a lot of political parties' first instinct is to look for wealthy candidates who are not afraid to spend their own money. Because per the court's decision in Buckley, a person can spend whatever they want on their own campaign. And so you'll see that. You'll see, for example, just to throw one out there, in Pennsylvania in 2022 and 2024, the Republican Party went with these very wealthy figures. It was actually Dr. Oz, the TV figure from, not Dr. Phil, from the Oprah show, I think, or something like that. He ran as the Republican nominee. His real name, by the way, is Mehmet Oz. And he ran in 2022. In 2024, they got a wealthy businessman by the name of David McCormick, who could, in addition to raising money for his Senate seat, also throw $10 million in or more and not even blink an eye. And then there's super PACs. Super PACs were sort of born out of the Citizens United case. These super PACs, these political action committees, often created by one individual, can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money as long as they do not give that money directly to campaigns or parties, and as long as they do not formally coordinate with those campaigns, which is a restriction, but in name only. If I want to start a super PAC for, say, Gavin Newsom to run for president in 2028, I can hire ad agencies that have worked for him in the past. I can work with campaign professionals who have worked with him in the past, and as long as we don't directly speak to each other, they know everything he wants to do politically. They know his plans. They know his policies. So it's basically seamless. It's just we keep the illusion of, oh, we're independent of one another, even though obviously I am coordinating with people who know him well and can do exactly what he wants to do, and who undoubtedly, have the phone numbers of some of the people in his campaign, and, it's a wink and a nod, basically. So, great example is the one I gave. Hollingsworth, the former congressman from Indiana. I mean, the super PAC was run by his dad and his brother. I'm guessing they talked. They just could not formally coordinate about the campaign. But I'm guessing that they, sat around the Thanksgiving table and talked about stuff. So it's a barrier, but not really. And then last but not least, and this did come up in the campaign finance film we watched, there's public funds. Maine does this. I know there's a couple other states that do this. California does this to a certain extent. If you limit your own personal fundraising to a certain amount, you get a preferred position in the ballot handbook, and you get your name listed as somebody who is not raising gobs of private money, as if, I hate to put it this way, as if that matters. There were, coming out of the Watergate reforms, public funds for the presidency, which until 1992 were used. So from 1976 to 1992, the elections for president were probably as fair as they came from a finance standpoint, because the two major party candidates got the exact same amount of money, and they had to make it last through the campaign. Just to show you how quaint this is, I think the last year or the second last year they had their second last election, they had it, either 88 or 92, the amount was $60 million. And there are going to be Senate races this year in just one state that will spend over $60 million. In fact, one, I believe, already has. I believe I want to say it's the Texas campaigns of Cruz and Allred are already right there or going to go over. Right? And we're only 30 years removed or so. Public funds for president have not been used since 1996. Presidential campaigns realized that the money was such that they could have no trouble raising that or more from individuals and groups and the people listed on this slide. And of course, in the last election, I think, not even counting third party spending on their behalves, in the 2020 election, I don't have the figures for 2024 yet. In the 2020 election, I want to say that both Trump and Biden spent somewhere between $850 and $950 million, I think it was. And that's just the campaigns again. That's not the super PACs that exist on their behalf. That's not any independent expenditures that were made on their behalf by, corporations and unions and whatnot. That's just the campaigns raised money to the tune of $850, almost $1 billion. Would not surprise me if this campaign went over $1 billion. But again, as I'm reading this to you, not reading it to you, I'm just talking to y'all, in July of 2024, we don't have those numbers yet. Okay, so that closes the book on campaigning. We now turn to the so-called linkage institutions, which, if we're being, formal about it, campaigns are a linkage institution. Campaigns connect us to the people who will be be the people running our government. But we'll look at three particular linkage institutions coming ahead that connect us to our government in a meaningful way. And the first of those will be political parties. That's what's up next. Have a great day, night, weekend. Actually, is the weekend right now as I'm doing this. And take care of yourselves, and we'll hit it next time.